You wandered into the wrong ballroom, sweetheart. No, I was invited. Catering uses the service door, honey. Franklin, be kind. The poor thing is lost. What outfit are you with exactly? Scout snipers. A while ago. You a sniper? A toast to the Lady Admiral. So, go on. What rank? Higher than yours. Have you ever watched a powerful man laugh at the one person he should have been saluting? In the next few minutes, you will watch that admiral realize who the woman in green truly is and what the halo inked on her wrist truly cost her. Comment where you are watching from. Drop a like and let us rewind. To understand why an admiral's face went white in front of 300 people, you have to leave that ballroom. You have to drive 400 miles from the marble and the chandeliers, out past the highways and the strip malls, to a small town in the hills where nobody has ever heard the name Saint. There's a hardware store on the corner of the main street there. It sells nails, paint, and garden hose, and it's run by a black woman in her 40s named Bridget Rhodes. The people in that town will tell you she is the calmest person they have ever met. She keeps the shelves neat. She fixes the broken things folks bring her, and half the time forgets to charge them. When old Mr. Alvarez came in last winter, unable to work the new lock on his door, she closed the register, drove to his house, fixed the lock, and drove back. She waved off the $10 he tried to push into her hand. That's who the town thinks she is. A kind, quiet woman who is good with her hands. She wears long sleeves in every season. If you ask her why, she smiles and says her arms get cold, and she changes the subject so gently that you never notice she did it. Nobody in that town knows what those sleeves are hiding. Nobody knows that the quiet woman selling them wood screws once did a thing that grown warriors still whisper about in the dark on bases on the other side of the planet. She likes it that way. She built her whole small life around being unremarkable, because being remarkable had already cost her everything she wasn't willing to lose again. Every morning before she flips the sign on the door, Bridget does one thing. She reaches into her collar and closes her fingers around a single, worn dog tag that hangs on a chain against her chest. The name stamped on it is not hers. It belonged to Daniel Hale, a lanky, laughing kid from Ohio, her spotter, the boy the men called Deacon, the only person on this earth who ever really saw her. She holds the tag for exactly the length of one breath. Then she lets it go and opens the store. And the world sees a shopkeeper. The world does not see the woman who lay on a freezing ridge for 11 hours and did not miss. The envelope came on a Tuesday. It was heavy, cream-colored, stamped with a seal she had spent 15 years trying to forget. She almost dropped it in the recycling without opening it. When she finally slid it open with a box cutter at the counter, her hand, the steadiest hand 3 armies had ever measured, shook just slightly. Inside was a letter that told her the mission on the ridge had finally been declassified. It told her that the country now knew what had happened up there. And it told her that in 3 weeks in Washington, in front of the flags and the cameras, they intended to place the Medal of Honor around her neck. She sat down on the stool behind the register and read it 4 times. She read about the ribbon and the ceremony and the guest list, and none of it touched her. Then she read the last line, the one that made her put the letter down flat on the counter and press her palm over it. It said the men she had saved would be present. It said the names of the fallen would be read aloud. Deacon's name, spoken out loud, in a room full of the living. At last. She didn't care about the medal. She had spent 15 years not caring about medals. She had a shoebox of ribbons in the back of a closet she never opened. But she cared about that one line. She cared about Deacon's name being spoken in the light instead of buried in a file with a stamp on it. So she took a dress out of the back of the closet. Decided at the last minute it wasn't right. Borrowed a green one from the widow 2 doors down and made up her mind. She would go. She would say almost nothing. She would hear his name. She would come home and open the store on Monday. She didn't know yet that she would arrive early, stand quietly by the bar, and be mistaken for the help. She didn't know who else would be in that room. She didn't know about the Admiral 400 miles away. In a life made entirely of marble, Admiral Franklin Pennington had never once in his career been told to use the service door. He was the kind of officer the Navy puts on posters, silver at the temples, straight as a mast, a jaw built for photographs. He had commanded task forces and shaken the hands of presidents. And this very month, his name was in front of the Senate for one of the highest posts a man in his uniform could ever hold. Everyone said the confirmation was a formality. Everyone said the 4th star was already engraved. And for years at galas exactly like this one, Admiral Pennington had told a story. He told it beautifully. He told it about a ridge on the far side of the world, about a SEAL element pinned in a dry riverbed with the light dying and the radios full of static, about how the enemy had them cold and how somehow out of the storm, an unseen shooter on a mountain a mile and a half away had cut the attackers down one impossible shot at a time until the boys could crawl out alive. He told it because one of those boys in the riverbed had been his own son, Sean. He told it as proof of the thing he loved most in the world, which was the legend of Franklin Pennington, father of a hero, leader of heroes, a man history was clearly building a pedestal for. He never told the part he didn't know. He never told them who the shooter was. The mission had been buried so deep that even he, with all his stars, only ever heard the shooter's call sign, a strange, soft word the survivors spoke like a prayer. Saint. He would say it at the end of the story, swirling his drink, and the table would go quiet, and he would let the quiet sit there and warm him. In 15 years, it had never once occurred to Admiral Pennington to go looking for Saint. It had never occurred to him that the person who saved his son might be waiting somewhere in long sleeves, holding a dog tag that was not her own. The legend was useful exactly the way it was, faceless and grand, a spotlight that happened to fall on him. So when he walked into that ballroom tonight, glowing, untouchable, 3 weeks from his 4th star, and saw an unfamiliar black woman standing alone by the bar in a green gown, he didn't see a hero. He saw someone who didn't belong in his room. And he decided, the way powerful men decide 100 small cruelties a day, that it would be amusing to remind her of that. He had told the story of Saint 100 times. He had never once imagined she would be standing 3 feet away, holding a glass of water while he told her to find the service door. 15 years before the emerald gown, before the hardware store, before the long sleeves, there was a mountain with no name that mattered, in a valley the maps barely bothered to label. It was the kind of place countries send their bravest children to and then classify so thoroughly that the bravery never officially happened. Bridget Rhodes was a Marine Scout sniper then, and she was already something the older instructors didn't have a word for. She didn't shoot the way other people shoot. She shot the way other people breathe, without deciding to, without effort. You could see wind drop, the slow spin of the earth, the small lie a mirage tells you about distance. She solved all of it somewhere below thought, and the round went exactly where the math said it would, every single time, until the men around her stopped calling it skill and started calling it something closer to grace. There were instructors who volunteered to spot for her just so they could tell people years later that they had. She had a spotter named Deacon. He was a lanky, freckled kid from Ohio who talked constantly and laughed at his own jokes, and could read wind through a spotting scope like scripture. He was the only person on the planet who was not a little afraid of her, and because of that, he was the only person she loved. He kept a running list of the food he was going to eat when they got home. He called her the most dangerous introvert in the hemisphere. One slow afternoon in a hide, bored out of his mind, he had taken a cheap tattoo needle and inked a tiny mark on the inside of her wrist, a thin ring, a halo floating over 2 crossed rifles. He grinned the whole time he did it. Every saint needs a halo, he told her, and you, Rhodes, are the patron saint of bad guys having a very bad day. She had rolled her eyes and called him an idiot. She had also never once in 15 years thought about having it removed. The day everything happened, a SEAL element got caught in a dry riverbed at the bottom of that valley. 9 men boxed in, taking fire from 3 sides as the light failed. One of them was a 20-year-old kid on his first real deployment named Sean Pennington. Though Bridget didn't know his name and wouldn't learn it for 15 years, what she knew, lying on the ridge a mile and a half above them, was that the storm was coming. The aircraft were grounded. The radios were drowning in static, and those 9 men were about to die in the dark while the whole world looked the other way. She and Deacon were the only angle. 2 people, 1 rifle, on a freezing shelf of rock against a valley full of men who wanted those boys dead. So she went to work. There is no honest way to make what she did that night sound small. The range was obscene. The wind came down the valley in gusts that would have thrown any normal shooter's round a full body's width wide. The light was gone, and then the storm swallowed even the stars. And still she read the valley through the scope like a page in a book she had already memorized. Deacon called the wind in a low, steady murmur. Hold half a value, now full, now hold. And she trusted him with her life, and the lives of 9 strangers. And she pressed the trigger. And a man who was about to overrun the riverbed simply stopped being a threat. Then another. Then another. For 11 hours she held that valley closed by will and mathematics. Her hands went past cold into a numbness that frightened even her, and she flexed them one at a time so she wouldn't lose the trigger. Every time the enemy massed to rush the trapped element, a shot came out of the impossible dark and took the heart out of the charge. There was a moment, hour 8, when a round cracked so close to her head that grit stung her cheek, and Deacon's hand landed flat on her back. He said, quiet as anything, "You're still here. Keep breathing." And she did. There was one shot that outlived all the others, the one the survivors would argue about for years afterward in bars and barracks, because none of them could ever make the numbers work. Near midnight, a heavy machine gun crew set up on the lip of the riverbed, close enough that the first burst would have ended everything. And there was no time and no light and a crosswind tearing straight down the valley. Deacon breathed the call. Bridget did not aim so much as decide. The gun never fired. The men in the wash heard the crack roll down the mountain a full second after the gunner fell, and one of them, a young man named Sean, put his face in the dirt and wept because he understood in that instant that somebody up on that mountain was simply refusing to let them die. The seals in the riverbed couldn't see her. They couldn't raise anyone on the net, but a soft voice told them again and again, in the calmest tone any of them had ever heard, to hold, to breathe, to move on her count. They didn't know if the voice was a man or a woman or an angel. On the radio, someone started calling the shooter Saint, because saints are what you pray to when nothing on earth can help you. And the name stuck to her like blood. She didn't miss. Not once. Not in 11 hours. Not in wind that should have made it impossible. Not when her vision blurred and her body begged her to stop. 9 men were breathing in that riverbed, and every breath was a shot she had not missed. And then, near the end, the mountain found her. An enemy element had climbed the back of the ridge in the storm, hunting the ghost that was gutting them. They found the hide. Deacon saw them a half-second before she did, and in that half-second, he did the only thing he ever really taught her about war, which had nothing to do with rifles. He put his body between the threat and hers. He shoved her flat and rose up into the danger, so she would have the half-second she needed to turn. She ended it. But when the shooting stopped and the wind screamed, and she reached for him in the dark, the laughing kid from Ohio was already gone. His hand still closed around his spotting scope, his blood freezing on the rock she had defended. She didn't fall apart. She couldn't afford to. Not yet. 9 men were still alive in that riverbed, and the night was not over. So she pulled Deacon's dog tag over his head and put it around her own neck, and she went back on the gun alone, her cheek wet and freezing, and she finished the night. When the storm finally broke before dawn, and the aircraft could fly, she came down off that ridge on foot to help pull out the last wounded man, because the medevac couldn't reach him, and she would not leave a job half done. He was the youngest of them, shot through the leg, half awake, and she knelt over him in the gray light and tied off the bleeding with hands that had not stopped being steady even now, for maybe 90 seconds. That boy looked up at the person saving his life. He was too far gone to hold her face, but he saw the wrist working the tourniquet close and clear, and inked on that wrist he saw a small, thin halo floating over 2 crossed rifles. Then hands pulled him onto the bird, and when he looked again, she was already gone, back up into the rocks to bring Deacon home, a shape dissolving into the dark. That boy was Sean Pennington, and for 15 years, in every quiet moment, he described the same 2 things to anyone who would listen. A voice that told him to breathe, and a halo on a wrist. The mission was buried. The valley was scrubbed from every record a civilian could ever reach. Bridget went home with a folded flag that was not for a husband and a dog tag that was not her own, and she disappeared into a small town and a small store and a life with long sleeves. The survivors, scattered across the fleet, did the only thing they could do for a hero they could not name. They pooled their money and had a single brass coin struck. On one side, a ridgeline. On the other, one word: Saint. Sean Pennington carried that coin in his pocket every day for 15 years, turning it over with his thumb until the edges went smooth, waiting for a chance he had stopped believing would ever come. Neither of them knew that the chance was 3 weeks away in a ballroom full of chandeliers, and that it would begin with his own father snapping a mocking salute at the patron saint of the riverbed, and asking her with a grin what rank she thought she was. Bridget arrived early on purpose. Crowds were a thing she managed rather than enjoyed, and she wanted to be settled before the room filled. Tucked near the bar with her back to a wall and a clear line to every door, she held a glass of water she did not intend to drink. She counted the exits without meaning to, the way she counted them everywhere, in churches and grocery stores, and now here. She was not there to be seen. She was there to hear one name read aloud and then to go home. She looked that night, quietly beautiful. The borrowed emerald gown fit her like it had been waiting for her all these years in someone else's closet. But she carried herself the way she carried everything, without a single wasted motion. And the officers who drifted past her registered only a calm, striking woman standing alone, and moved on. She had spent her whole life being looked at and not seen, and she had made a kind of peace with it. Being invisible had kept her alive more than once. Admiral Franklin Pennington did not do peace. He did dominance. He swept into the ballroom with Cheryl on his arm and a wake of deference behind him, and his eyes moved across the room, the way a landlord's move across a property he owns. When they landed on Bridget, something in him decided she was a discrepancy, a woman he didn't recognize, not on anyone's arm, not in anyone's chain of command, standing in his ballroom as if she had a right to the floor. To a man like Pennington, that was not a person. That was a small problem to be corrected in front of an audience. For sport. "You wandered into the wrong ballroom, sweetheart," he said, and the word landed exactly as he meant it to, soft and filthy with condescension. Bridget turned her head slowly. She had heard that tone 10,000 times from drill instructors who assumed she would quit, and enemies who assumed she would miss. She gave him a small, polite smile, the smile of a woman deciding, for now, to be gracious. "No," she said. "I was invited." He stepped in front of her, cutting her off from the room, and the game began in earnest. "Catering uses the service door, honey. What outfit are you with exactly?" He let his eyes crawl down the emerald gown and then flicked one finger at the bare curve of her shoulder, at the place where a uniform would carry the weight of a career, as if to point out how empty it was. Around him, a few officers chuckled because he was an admiral, and laughing along was easy and safe. Cheryl floated up in silver silk, sipping champagne, and joined the hunt with the casual cruelty of a woman who had never once in her life been the target of it. "Franklin, be kind," she purred, not meaning a syllable of it. "The poor thing is lost." She said it to the little crowd, not to Bridget, the way you talk about a stray dog that has wandered into a nice restaurant. One young officer near the edge of the crowd shifted his weight, uncomfortable, and half opened his mouth as if to say something. Pennington caught it and waved him down without even turning his head, the way you wave off a waiter who has come at the wrong moment. And the young man closed his mouth and looked down at his shoes. That small surrender settled over the whole crowd. Nobody was going to stop this. Cheryl leaned toward a friend and said loud enough to Carrie that she simply did not understand how they let just anyone into these things anymore. And the friend laughed behind a ringed hand, and 2 more phones rose to catch the Admiral being witty. To everyone watching, it looked like exactly what the powerful always want cruelty to look like. Harmless, funny, earned. Here is the thing. The whole laughing room did not understand. Bridget Rhodes could have ended it with one sentence. She could have said a word or two quietly, and watched the color drain out of the Admiral's handsome face right there. She had ended far more dangerous men than him with far less. But she was tired in a way none of them could imagine. Tired down in the marrow, and she had not driven 400 miles to win a fight with a peacock. She had come to hear Deacon's name. So she held still, and she let him talk. And she paid the toll the way people like her have always been made to pay it, with silence and a straight spine. Somewhere behind her ribs the ridge stirred, the cold and the wind and Deacon's hand flat on her back, and she breathed it down the way she had trained herself to, and she stayed quiet. "Scout snipers," she said, when he demanded again what she could possibly have been a while ago. It was the truest, most understated thing a human being said in that building all night. He laughed out loud. "You a sniper?" He said it to the room, not to her. And the room gave him the laugh he wanted. A phone came up at the edge of the crowd. Then a second one, filming the fun. Because a laughing admiral is content, and content is currency. Emboldened, Pennington reached for the grand gesture, the thing that would make the story worth retelling at breakfast. He lifted his glass high. "A toast," he announced, "to the Lady Admiral," and then he snapped his heels together and threw her a crisp, mocking salute, holding it, milking it, while the officers around him grinned and the phones drank it in. Not everyone was laughing. Along the wall, an older Marine in dress blues had gone very still, his eyes moving from the halo of laughter to the quiet woman at its center. A small frown gathering near the doors. A senior enlisted man with 30 years on his sleeve had set his jaw to stone and folded his arms. They did not yet know who she was. They only knew, the way old soldiers always know, that something about the quiet woman by the bar did not fit the joke being told about her. and that men who mistake stillness for weakness are usually the last ones to find out they were wrong. The older Marine by the wall, the one who had gone still at the start of all this, took one step off the wall and then stopped himself because he outranked no one here, and a scene would only make it worse for her. He would tell people later that he had never in 40 years wanted so badly to be wrong about what he was watching. He looked at the woman setting down her glass of water and thought, that is not the stillness of someone who is afraid. That is the stillness of someone deciding whether to be merciful. And inside that stillness, Bridget was doing the arithmetic she had done her whole life. How much does it cost me to let this go? How much does it cost me to end it? She had learned on a mountain that the loudest answer is almost always silence, and that the men who most deserve to be humbled will usually do the job themselves if you only give them enough rope and enough time. So, she gave him rope, she waited, she let him climb. Pennington leaned in close, grinning ear to ear, going for the finish. So, go on, he said. What rank? Bridget set her glass of water down on the bar without a sound. She looked at him, this shining man who had never in his life been cold or afraid or alone on a mountain. This man playing a hero in a room full of medals. And for one moment, 15 years of swallowed grief moved behind her eyes and then went still again. Higher than yours, she said. She said it quietly. She did not say it as a boast. She said it the way you state a fact that happens to be true, the way you would say the sky is up. And because the room could not imagine a universe in which it was true, the room laughed harder than ever. Cheryl actually clapped, delighted. The Admiral wiped a tear of laughter from the corner of his eye, shaking his head at the sheer nerve of this nobody in a green dress. And he reached out one hand to pat her on the cheek. The final insult. The little tap you give a child who has said something adorable and stupid. His fingers brushed past her cheek and grazed her wrist, and the emerald sleeve, loose at the cuff, slid back 2 inches. 2 inches of skin. A thin ring. A halo floating over 2 crossed rifles. The exact mark a bleeding boy had memorized on the worst night of his life and described 1,000 times since. And Admiral Franklin Pennington, who had told the legend of Saint 100 times without ever once looking for her face, finally looked down and saw it inked on the wrist of the woman he had just called catering. The laugh died in his throat like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. For a moment, Admiral Pennington's face did nothing at all, because his mind refused the information. He knew that mark. He had never seen it, and yet he knew it better than his own reflection, because his son had drawn it for him on 100 napkins, described it in 100 late-night phone calls, tattooed it into the private mythology of the Pennington family. A halo over crossed rifles. The mark on the wrist of the ghost who came down off the mountain and saved the boy in the riverbed. The mark of Saint. His hand was still in the air, hovering by her cheek. He pulled it back slowly, as if the woman were made of fire, and his mouth opened and produced nothing. Across the ballroom, Lieutenant Sean Pennington had been half listening to his father hold court, the way he had learned to half listen years ago. Then he saw the old man's face change, saw the color pour out of it, and he followed his father's frozen stare down to a woman's wrist. And Sean Pennington, decorated SEAL, veteran of the worst places on the map, stopped being an officer and became again in one heartbeat a 20-year-old boy dying in a dry riverbed, while a calm voice told him to breathe. He crossed the room without knowing he was moving. People stepped out of his way. He stopped in front of her, and his eyes went from the halo to her face and back, and his mouth worked before any sound came out. Saint. It came out cracked and small, the voice of a much younger man. My God, it's you. It's her. Every glass in the room stopped moving. Bridget looked at the young man in front of her, at his tears, at the ruined disbelief on his face, and something in her chest that she had kept clamped shut for 15 years shifted half an inch. She had never known his name, but she knew that leg. She had knelt over that leg in the gray light and tied it off with her own 2 hands. And she had spent 15 years not knowing whether the boy at the end of it had lived or died on the flight home. Now here he stood, alive, wearing the trident. You made it off the ridge, she said quietly. It was not a question. It was 15 years of a wound she never let herself name, closing over at last. Sean's hand was already shaking as it went to his pocket. He drew out a coin, worn smooth at the edges from 15 years of being turned over by a thumb that could not stop. A brass coin. A ridgeline on one face, one word on the other. He took her hand, the one with the halo, and he pressed the coin into her palm and closed her fingers around it, and he could barely get the words out. We had these made, he whispered, all of us. The 9. You. We never knew your name. We never knew your face. We just knew you were real. And we swore we would never stop looking for you. His voice broke completely. Ma'am, I have carried this every single day for 15 years, praying to God I would get to put it in your hand. I have a wife. I have a daughter. They exist because of you. Everything I have exists because of you. And that was the moment the ballroom understood that something enormous was happening, even though most of them still did not know what. Up on the low stage, a 4-star general who had been waiting quietly by the podium set down his own glass and stepped to the microphone. He was the presiding officer of the evening, and he had known exactly who the woman in the emerald gown was from the second she walked in. And he had watched the admiral's little performance from across the room with a face like a slowly closing door. He tapped the microphone once. The whole room turned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of that marble hall. "We are here tonight for one reason, to finally and publicly honor an American whose actions were classified for 15 years. He looked directly at Bridget. "Tonight, this nation awards the Medal of Honor to a Marine Scout sniper who held a ridge alone through a storm for 11 hours and brought 9 trapped SEALs home alive. For 15 years, the men she saved knew her only by a single word." He paused and let the pause do its work. "Tonight, we can finally say her name. Bridget Rhodes. Some of you know her better as Saint." The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was something lower and older than applause. It was 300 professional warriors sucking in the same breath at the same instant, and then, one by one, beginning to get to their feet. The general kept reading. He read the citation. He read the range and the wind and the 11 hours. And grown officers who had seen everything shook their heads slowly because they understood better than any civilian ever could that the numbers he was reading should not be possible. He read the line that made Sean Pennington's knees nearly buckle. The line about how, after 11 hours on the gun, the shooter had come down off the ridge on foot into the open to carry out the last wounded man by hand because the aircraft could not reach him in time. Half the room turned to look at Sean without meaning to, because half the room had heard him tell that story. The story of the steady hands and the halo. At one gala or another across 15 years, they had always assumed it was the beautiful exaggeration of a man who had survived something no one should survive. They understood now, all at once, that he had never exaggerated a single word of it. And then he read the part Bridget had driven 400 miles to hear. He read the names of the fallen. And when he reached one name, when he said the words Corporal Daniel Hale Spotter, who gave his life shielding his teammates so that she could continue the fight, Bridget Rhodes, the woman who had not missed a shot in 11 hours, who had buried her grief in a small town for 15 years, finally closed her eyes and let 2 tears fall down her face. Deacon's name, spoken aloud in the light, in a room full of the living, at last. That was all she had ever come for. Everything else in that ballroom was noise. And then the general did the thing that turned Admiral Pennington's private disaster into a public one. "For those who may have forgotten the tradition," the general said, letting his gaze drift just once, deliberately, to the frozen admiral. "The Medal of Honor is the one distinction in this country that reverses the salute. Every member of the armed forces, regardless of grade, up to and including the most senior flag officer in this room, renders the first salute to its recipient. Rank does not outrank the medal. Nothing does. Higher than yours." She had told him the truth. She had told him the plainest, most literal truth in the entire building, and he had laughed in her face and reached out to pat her cheek like she was a child. Now the whole room knew it. Now the whole room turned to look at the shining admiral with the 4th star already engraved. The man who had told the legend of Saint at a dozen dinners to make himself glow, and who had just spent 5 minutes mocking her to catering staff in front of 300 witnesses and a dozen raised phones. Sean was the first to render it. He stepped back, drew himself up to full rigid attention in front of the woman who had saved his life, and brought his hand up in the slowest, most reverent salute of his career, tears running openly down his face and off his jaw. Then the older Marine by the wall saluted. Then the senior enlisted man by the doors. Then, like a tide coming in the room, 300 people came to attention for the quiet woman in the emerald gown. A young ensign near the stage was crying and did not care who saw him do it. The bartender, a retired chief who had poured drinks at galas like this for 20 years and seen every kind of important person there is, sat down his towel and came to attention behind the bar. Even the camera crew hired to film the evening slowly lowered their equipment and stood. In the middle of all that motion, Bridget stood perfectly still, The brass coin pressed so hard into her palm that its edges printed a small ridgeline into her own skin, a mark she would find hours later and not remember making. She was not thinking about the Admiral. In the private country behind her eyes, she had already forgiven him and let him go. She was thinking about a boy from Ohio who should have been standing right here to see this. And in the middle of that rising tide of respect stood one man who had not moved, could not move, whose hand would not obey him, whose handsome face had gone the exact color of ash. Admiral Franklin Pennington finally understood that the joke he had told to the whole room was about to become the story the whole world told about him, and that the only way out was to lift his hand and salute the woman he had just humiliated in front of every camera in the building, or refuse and end his career where he stood. He tried to talk his way out of it first. Men like him always try to talk first. "Ma'am," he said, and the word came out strangled. Nothing like the silk he had used on her a minute ago. "I had no idea. We were only having a bit of fun. I never would have if I had known who you—" And he heard himself. Heard the shape of the sentence forming and could not finish it, because there was no end to it that was not a confession. "If I had known who you were, I would have treated you like a human being." That was the sentence. Every person in that room finished it for him in their heads. And the finishing of it was the worst thing that had ever happened to Franklin Pennington. Bridget let him hang there. She did not rescue him, and she did not stab him. She simply waited, the coin warm in her closed hand, and let the silence do what silence does to a man who has just run out of charm in front of the only audience that ever mattered to him. Later, the people who were there would say the strangest part was how ordinary he suddenly looked, stripped of the room's deference. He was just a graying man in a well-cut uniform who had made a cruel bet in public and lost it in public. The medals on his chest, which had glittered an hour ago, looked all at once like what they actually were. Small pieces of ribbon and metal that a committee had chosen to give him. Nothing at all like the single plain star that was about to hang at the throat of the woman he had told to use the service door. He reached out of pure reflex for the easy charm that had carried him through every hard moment of his life, and found the drawer empty. Then she spoke, and she spoke gently, which was somehow far worse for him than shouting would have been. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said. "That's the whole point, Admiral. You should have been kind to catering." It was not a taunt. It was not a line built to draw blood. It was a quiet correction from a woman who had earned the right to correct him 10,000 times over, and it landed in that room like a verdict read from a bench. A few people exhaled. Somebody near the back said "Amen" under their breath and did not bother to hide it. Pennington's hand finally came up. He had no choice left, and everyone watching knew he had no choice, which stripped the gesture of the last shred of dignity he might have salvaged from it. He saluted her. The man who had snapped a mocking salute at her 90 seconds earlier now held a real one, stiff and trembling, his eyes wet with something that was not sorrow so much as terror, the pure terror of a man watching his own reflection crack down the middle. He held it because she outranked the stars on his shoulders, because a small, heavy medal was about to sit at her throat, and his 4 stars would bow to it for the rest of his natural life. Bridget returned the salute. Crisp, correct, unhurried. She gave him the exact courtesy he had refused her, and, in giving it, she made the difference between the two of them a thing that no one in that room would ever be able to unsee. That was the whole of her revenge. She was simply visibly the better person, and she let 300 witnesses do the math. Beside him, his wife had already begun to leave him, though she had not yet moved a single step. Cheryl Pennington had spent the evening laughing at the woman in green. She had clapped her manicured hands, and now she stood next to her husband with the fixed, bright, panicking smile of a woman who has just watched her entire investment catch fire in public. She was not thinking about the hero. She was not thinking about the 9 men or the Ridge or Daniel Hale. She was thinking about the cameras, about the confirmation, about the gala's next season, and whether she would still be seated at the good tables or quietly move to the bad ones. Slowly, deliberately, she unhooked her hand from Franklin's arm and took one small step sideways, opening a gap of cold air between herself and the man she had married for exactly the future that was now dissolving in front of 300 phones. He noticed. Of course he noticed. It was the loneliest step anyone took all night, and it was taken by the person standing closest to him. The presiding general was still watching from the stage, and his face had already made a decision that would be formalized in careful memos over the following week. There is a phrase in the culture Pennington had lived inside his entire life: conduct unbecoming. Everyone in that ballroom heard those two words clearly, without anyone speaking them aloud. A man 3 weeks from the second highest post in his service had on camera mocked and belittled a Medal of Honor recipient he mistook for the help. There was no version of the confirmation hearing that survived that footage. There was no committee on earth that would put a 4th star on that shoulder. Now the engraver could put down his tools. By morning, the clip would have a name of its own online, a short and ugly title that would follow him into every room for the rest of his life. By noon, a spokesman would be drafting the first careful sentence of a statement that no one would believe. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, he only had to stand in the wreckage of the room he had ruled an hour ago and feel the deference drain out of it, person by person, like water out of a cracked glass. His aide, a sharp young officer who had hitched his own career to the Admiral's rising star, was already checking his watch and beginning, somewhere behind his eyes, the quiet work of pretending he had always found the man a little distasteful. Not one person in that room was on his side anymore, and he knew it. But the deepest cut of the whole night did not come from the general, or the cameras, or the wife peeling herself away from his side. It came from his own son. Sean had not left Bridget's side. He stood a half step behind her now, positioned without thinking, in the ancient posture of a man guarding something precious. And when his father finally looked at him with the desperate, silent plea of a parent begging a child to make it all stop, Sean simply shook his head. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only the closest people heard it, and that made it carry further than any shout. "I have carried her coin for 15 years, Dad," Sean said. "You told her story at dinner parties to make people admire you, and when she walked into your room, you called her catering and told her to use the service door." He swallowed hard. "I have wanted to find her my whole adult life, just so I could say thank you to her face. You found her in 10 seconds, and you used her for a laugh." He shook his head again, slow. "I don't know who you are." Franklin Pennington had commanded fleets. He had been received by presidents. And now he stood in the center of a ballroom he had walked into like a king an hour ago. And he had nothing. No rank that counted in this room. No wife on his arm. No son at his side. No story left that made him the hero of it. Only 300 witnesses and one small polished truth in a green dress who had beaten him without ever once raising her voice. He had spent his whole life making sure he was the most important man in every room he entered, and it had taken one quiet woman, one halo, and a single sentence about catering to show him that he had never, not once, understood what importance actually was. They gave her the medal that night, the way it was always meant to be given, in front of the flags, with the citation read slowly, so that every word had room to land. When the general lifted the pale blue ribbon over her head and settled the small, heavy star against the emerald gown, Bridget Rhodes did not stand taller or prouder. She stood exactly as she had stood by the bar an hour before, calm, contained, a woman who had already carried far heavier things than a medal against that same chest. Then they asked her to say something, and the room that had laughed at her went so quiet you could hear the chandeliers hum. "I'm not going to talk about the ridge," she said. "The men who were there already know, and the ones who weren't don't need the details to understand it. I'll only say this. I did not hold that mountain alone. A boy from Ohio named Daniel Hale held it with me, and he is the reason 9 men came home, and he did not. And every good thing I have been given since that night belongs partly to him." She let that sit in the silence. People spent this evening surprised that someone like me could be someone like this. I have spent my whole life watching people decide who I am by what I have on. A uniform, a green dress, an apron. So, here is the only thing I know for certain after all of it. The person you look right through in the room, the one you wave toward the service door, the one you decide is nobody worth your time, that is very often the exact person holding the line that you are standing safely behind. Be kind to the people you have decided are beneath you. You are almost never standing as high up as you think you are. She did not look at the Admiral when she said it. She did not have to. Nobody in that room would ever forget who the sentence was for. In the weeks that followed, the story went where such stories go now. Everywhere, all at once. The footage of a beaming admiral mocking a Medal of Honor recipient he had mistaken for catering, and then being forced to salute her while his own son wept openly beside her, became the kind of thing the whole country watched and argued about over dinner. Admiral Franklin Pennington's name was quietly withdrawn from consideration for the post everyone had sworn was already his. There was a review. There was a statement full of the word regret. There was, in the end, an early retirement dressed up in language designed to sound like a choice. The fourth star was never engraved. Cheryl did not stay for the part where the invitations stopped coming. She was gone by spring, and the grand house went on the market. And the man who had once walked into every room like a king learned what it was to walk into a room and watch it go quiet, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with awe. Bridget did not celebrate any of it. That was never what she had come for. What she did was drive to a small house in Ohio where a gray-haired woman still kept a bedroom exactly the way her son had left it 15 years before. Bridget sat at that woman's kitchen table for a long afternoon and told her in detail for the very first time exactly what Daniel had done on the ridge, how he had read the wind like scripture, how he had kept a running list of the meals he was going to eat when he got home, how he had put his body between the danger and hers without a heartbeat of hesitation, and died a spotter's death, watching over someone else to the last. And then Bridget took the worn brass coin that Sean had pressed into her palm, the one the 9 men had carried for 15 years, and she closed it into the mother's hands. "They made this for the person your son saved," she said, "so it belongs with the person who made him." She started something with his name on it, the Hale Fund, for the families of the men and women who serve in the quiet places and come home to nothing, or do not come home at all. In its first year, the Hale Fund put the daughter of a fallen reconnaissance Marine through her first year of college, paid off the medical debt of a spotter who came home in pieces the country never bothered to count, and quietly covered a funeral for a family that could not afford to bury their own son. None of it ever made the news. Bridget preferred it exactly that way. The whole point, she told Sean, was to be the thing that shows up in the dark when nobody is watching and nobody will ever know, because she had been saved by exactly that kind of thing once on a mountain, and she intended to spend the rest of her life paying the debt forward, one quiet name at a time. Sean Pennington runs it alongside her now. He still calls her ma'am. She still tells him to stop. He never will. He brings his daughter to the hardware store on Bridget's birthday every year, and half the town has finally started to wonder about the calm woman who sells them wood screws, and she has slowly, at long last, stopped minding if they find out. She still wears long sleeves most days, but now sometimes, when a kid at the counter is having a hard week or a young soldier home on leave wanders in looking lost and hollowed out, she rolls her cuff back a couple of inches on purpose and lets them see the halo over the crossed rifles. And she tells them the truth that cost her everything and saved 9 lives, that the quiet ones are watching over them, that the overlooked ones are so often the ones holding the line, that you never ever know who is standing right next to you at the bar. A strange and wonderful thing happened in the months after the video spread. Bridget started getting letters, not from admirals or reporters, but from the invisible people. A janitor who had mopped the same office floors for 30 years. A home health aide nobody had ever once thanked. A quiet kid in a small town who had been told his whole life that he was nobody, and had very nearly come to believe it. They all said some version of the very same thing. "I saw what she told that admiral about the service door, and I stood up a little straighter today." She answered every last one of them by hand. She figured she owed them that much, because she had been each of them at some point, and because a line held in the dark is only ever worth the people standing safe behind it. Deacon would have laughed at the size of the mail pile, she thought, and then he would have read every letter twice. And every morning before she flips the sign on the door, she still closes her fingers around a dog tag that is not hers for the length of one single breath. Only now his name has been spoken in the light in a room full of the living, and she can finally let the tag rest warm against her chest instead of cold. If this story moved you, if you have ever been the person somebody waved toward the service door, tell us about it in the comments below. Subscribe and stay a while, because we tell the stories of the overlooked and the underestimated here. And share this one with somebody who needs the reminder tonight, because sometimes the person you almost mistook for nobody is a saint with a halo on her wrist, and you are standing safely behind a line she is still holding. Okay, I need a second because this one genuinely wrecked me. 15 years. She sold wood screws in a tiny town for 15 years and never told a single soul she held an entire mountain by herself. And this man looks at a literal queen and goes, "Use the service door?" Nah. The salute at the end had me all the way in my feelings. And the son whispering, "I don't know who you are," to his own father, ice cold and fully deserved. The moral is real simple, you guys. Be so unbelievably kind to the quiet people, because you have absolutely no idea who they are. Drop a heart if you think she earned that medal 100 times over.